The day my father-in-law offered me a job cleaning his office bathrooms for $38,000 a year, I smiled, thanked him, and said I'd think about it. He probably went home that night feeling generous. I went home knowing that by Friday his lawyers would be on the phone with my lawyers, and nothing in his world would ever look the same again. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Raymond. No, wait. Let me start over, because that's not how this story actually begins. This story begins in the fall of 1987, in a parking lot behind a community college in Columbus, Ohio, where I was 26 years old, driving a truck with a cracked windshield and a heater that only worked on the left side. I was an electrician's apprentice making $14 an hour, and I thought I was doing just fine. That's where I met my wife. She was standing next to a payphone arguing with someone. Her father, I'd find out later, and she had this look on her face like she was 2 words away from hanging up and never calling back. She had dark hair pulled up in a clip that was losing the fight, and she was wearing a coat that was too thin for October in Ohio. I asked if she was okay. She said she was fine in the tone of voice people use when they are absolutely not fine. I offered her my coffee from the vending machine because I hadn't opened it yet. She took it without thinking, and then looked embarrassed and then laughed. Her name was June. She was 23. Her father was Harlan Whitmore, and he owned Whitmore Industrial Supply, a company he'd built from a single warehouse in Dayton into something that, by the time we got married, was quietly becoming one of the largest privately held industrial distributors in the Midwest. June didn't talk about it much. Her relationship with her father was complicated in the way that daughters and self-made men's relationships tend to be complicated. He loved her, I think, in the way some men love things they consider to be reflections of themselves. She had his chin and his stubbornness and none of his appetite for competition. She became a school librarian. She read novels. She made soup from scratch on Sunday afternoons, and our house always smelled like something warm. I never told her about the shares. I need to explain that, because I know how it sounds. I know what people think when they hear a man kept a secret like that from his wife for 31 years. They think deception. They think control. They think something dark. But I want you to understand what it actually was, and then you can judge me however you want. In 1991, 4 years into our marriage, I was doing electrical contracting work on an expansion project for one of Whitmore Industrial's warehouse facilities outside of Cincinnati. I was still an electrician, still driving a truck, still the man June's father introduced at family dinners as June's husband without ever using my first name. His name was Harlan, and he was the kind of man who sized you up in the first 30 seconds and filed you under a category you'd spend the rest of your life trying to get out of. He'd filed me under not good enough. During that job, I met a man named Whitfield Donahue. He was one of Harlan's early investors. A quiet man, 70s, wore the same brown cardigan to every meeting, drove a 10-year-old Buick. He pulled me aside one afternoon while I was checking the circuit load on the new loading dock. He said he'd been watching me work for 3 weeks. He said he liked the way I solved problems. He said he was looking for someone who understood operations from the ground up, not from a boardroom window. He didn't offer me a job. He offered me a stake. He was selling a portion of his equity position in Whitmore Industrial, a slice he'd accumulated over 20 years of quiet investment. And he needed a buyer who understood what the company actually was versus what Harlan thought it was. The price he named was everything I had, plus a loan I had no business taking out on an electrician's salary, plus 3 years of austerity that nearly broke June's patience with me more than once. She thought we were paying down debt. We were. The loan debt. On shares in her father's company. By 1994, I owned 9% of Whitmore Industrial Supply. I didn't tell her because I didn't know how to tell her without it becoming about her father. And it wasn't about her father, it was about the work. It was about the fact that I had looked at that company's logistics operation and seen something no one else was seeing, a structural inefficiency in their distribution routing that was costing them 11% in unnecessary overhead. And I knew I knew with the kind of certainty that doesn't come from spreadsheets, but from years of being on loading docks at 5 in the morning, that if someone fixed it, the company would double its value in a decade. I also didn't tell her because Harlan would have made it a battle, and I wasn't ready for that battle yet. I needed time. Over the next 15 years, I kept building. Whitfield Donahue sold me more shares when he retired in 1999. I bought from 2 other early minority investors who'd lost patience with Harlan's management style. I never attended board meetings under my own name in the early years. I had a small holding company, Garrison Capital LLC, registered in Delaware, and Harlan Whitmore had no idea that Garrison Capital was his son-in-law from Columbus who came to Thanksgiving dinner in a Carhartt jacket and asked for seconds of the green bean casserole. By 2006, Garrison Capital held 31% of Whitmore Industrial. By 2018, it was 43%. June and I lived in the same house we'd bought in 1993. 3 bedrooms, a yard, a garage. I'd converted into a workshop. Our daughter Emma grew up there. She went to Ohio State on a combination of scholarships and money. I moved quietly through a custodial account, and she never questioned why her parents, a retired electrician and a librarian, seemed to be more comfortable than the math suggested. I think she assumed we were better at saving than most people. We were, in a sense. Emma married a good man named Clifford, not from the file. I'm picking that name fresh. And they lived 20 minutes from us, and Sunday dinners were the best part of my week. June's father remained convinced for 31 years that I was a moderately successful electrical contractor who had gotten lucky by being in the right place at the right time. When I asked his daughter to dance at a cousin's wedding, he said as much. Not to me directly, but I heard it. June heard it more. He had a way of mentioning real business in my presence, the way some men mention a foreign country they've been to that they know you haven't. He introduced me to his associates as June's husband. He's in trades. He once told June at a birthday dinner for their mother that he wished she'd married someone with more direction. She told me about it that night in the car on the way home. I held her hand and said nothing, and she leaned her head against the window and watched the highway lights go past. And I thought, not yet. The offer happened in March of 2022. Harlan was 77 by then. He'd had a mild stroke the previous winter, and his doctor had been making noises about stress and succession, and he'd finally admitted to himself what his board had been saying for 3 years. Whitmore Industrial needed new leadership. He'd been in conversations with 2 private equity groups about a partial buyout that would bring in outside management. He was also, I learned from my attorney, in the process of trying to consolidate minority shareholder positions to simplify the cap table before those conversations got serious. He did not know he was trying to buy out his own son-in-law. He invited June and me to dinner at his house in Indian Hill, the big house, the one with the circular driveway and the dining room that seated 16. His wife Beverly made a roast. The grandchildren were there. It was supposed to be warm and family-focused, and for the first 90 minutes, it was. Then Harlan asked the grandchildren to go watch something in the other room. Beverly excused herself to the kitchen, and Harlan looked at me across the table with the particular expression of a man who has decided he is about to do someone a favor. He said he'd been thinking about me, about my years in the trades, about how I was 61 now, and he supposed I must be thinking about what came next. He said there was an opening at the company, a facilities oversight position, overseeing building maintenance across 4 warehouse locations. It would keep me busy. The salary was $42,000 a year, benefits included. He said he thought it might suit me well. He called it a good fit for a man like you. I looked at him for a long moment. June had gone very still beside me. I said I appreciated the thought. He said he'd need an answer by the end of the month because they were also looking at bringing in a facilities management firm, but he wanted to give family the first consideration. Family. I said, Harlan, "Can I ask you something?" He said, "Of course." I said, "Do you know who Garrison Capital is?" The name didn't land immediately. He repeated it back to me like he was testing the sound of it. Garrison Capital. I could see him sorting through his memory, the way people do when they've heard a name in a meeting once and didn't file it carefully. I said, "They're your largest single shareholder. They've held a position in Whitmore Industrial since 1994, currently sitting at 43%. He said he was aware of his shareholder structure. Thank you. I said, "Garrison Capital is mine, Harlan. I am Garrison Capital." The room got quiet in a way that rooms only get quiet when something irreversible has just been said. He stared at me. I watched him process it. I watched him go through the stages. Confusion, then disbelief, then the beginning of anger, then something that looked, briefly, almost like fear. He said that wasn't possible. I said I could have my attorney send over the documentation that evening if he'd like. He said he didn't believe me. I said that was his right, and I understood it was a lot to take in. But the documentation existed, and it was accurate, and we should probably talk about it in the morning when everyone had slept. June was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger. Not exactly. Something more like standing at the edge of a very large space and trying to understand the dimensions of it. Harlan said very quietly, "Why?" I said, "Because I believed in the company. Because Whitfield Donahue believed in me, and because I wanted to know that when I sat at your table, I was there because June wanted me there, not because of what I owned or didn't own." He said that didn't make any sense. I said, "I know it doesn't make sense to you, but it made sense to me." We drove home mostly in silence. "About 10 minutes from the house," June said. 43%. Not a question. Just letting the number exist in the air between us. I said yes. She was quiet for another mile. Then she said, "How long have you been carrying this?" I said, 31 years, give or take." She didn't say anything for the rest of the drive. When we got home, she made tea, which she always does when she needs to think. I sat across from her at the kitchen table and waited. I didn't make excuses. I didn't explain. I had 31 years of explanations ready, and none of them felt adequate in that moment. So I just sat there and let her be, wherever she needed to be. After a while, she said, "Did you ever think about telling me?" I said I thought about it every time her father introduced me as the man in trades. She looked at me. I said, "I didn't want you to have to manage it. I didn't want our marriage to be about it. I wanted it to be about us, and I was wrong not to tell you. I've known that for a long time." She wrapped her hands around her mug. She said, "He really offered you a janitor job." I said, "Facilities oversight." She made a sound that was almost a laugh, and then stopped being almost a laugh, and then was a laugh. Reluctant, then less reluctant. I didn't laugh yet. I waited for permission. She shook her head slowly. She said, "You sat there and thanked him." I said I'd think about it. She put her mug down and looked at me with those eyes that have known me since I was 26 years old, with a cracked windshield in an October parking lot. And she said, "You are the strangest man I have ever met." I said I knew. She said, "I'm furious with you." I said I knew that too. She said, "I need some time." I gave her time. 2 weeks of careful distance, of sleeping in the same bed but with more space between us than usual, of mornings where she was polite, and evenings where she was quiet, and Sunday dinner where she told Emma and Clifford that her father had made some surprising discoveries about family finances without saying more than that. Harlan called 3 times. I took the 3rd call. He'd had his attorneys look at the shareholder documentation. He did not apologize, but he spoke to me in a register I had never heard from him before, measured, almost careful, the way a man speaks when the ground he's standing on turns out to be different from what he assumed. He asked about my intentions. I told him I had no interest in disrupting the company or the private equity conversations. I told him I thought the company deserved strong management and that I'd been a silent partner for 31 years and intended to remain a thoughtful one. He said he supposed he owed me more credit than he'd given. I said he owed me nothing. I said what he owed June was a conversation. He had that conversation. I wasn't in the room. June told me afterward that he cried, which she had never seen him do, not even at her mother's funeral 3 years earlier. He said he hadn't known. She said he hadn't known. She said she hadn't known either. He said he'd been wrong about me. She said she didn't need him to tell her that. She'd figured that out herself years ago. What changed is harder to describe than what happened. Harlan and I don't have a relationship now that looks like friendship exactly. He's 80 now. He walks with a cane. We see him at the holidays and at Emma's kids' birthdays, and he calls me by my first name, which sounds small and isn't. He asked my opinion about the private equity deal last year. Actually asked directly, man to man. And I told him what I thought, honestly, and he listened. That's more than I expected. Maybe more than either of us deserved. June and I are okay. Better than okay most mornings. It took the better part of a year for the trust to fully settle back into place, and there were nights in that year where I lay awake thinking I had miscalculated badly, that the secret had cost more than it gave. I still think that sometimes. I don't have a clean answer for it. What I have is this. She's sitting across from me right now at the kitchen table in the house we've lived in since 1993, reading a novel with a cup of tea going cold beside her because she always forgets to drink it and the yard outside is turning green again after the winter. And later today, Emma is bringing the grandkids over, and the house will be loud for a few hours in the way that makes you understand what all of it was for. I was an electrician for 28 years. I built something quietly on the side, not to be powerful, not to prove a point to a man who'd already decided who I was, though I'd be lying if I said that played no part, but because I saw something worth building, and building things is what I know how to do. The shares are still mine. Garrison Capital is still 43%. The private equity deal went through in the fall, and I'm now on a formal advisory board, sitting in rooms that my father-in-law used to keep me out of, and nobody introduces me as the man in trades anymore. But I still drive a truck. Same brand as 30 years ago, newer model. The heater works on both sides now. Some things you upgrade, some things you keep because they remind you of the parking lot, and the payphone, and the girl with the too-thin coat who took your coffee without thinking, and then felt bad about it and then laughed. That laugh is still the best thing I ever heard. Everything else. The shares, the boardrooms, the moment I watched Harlan Whitmore's certainty fall off his face like something that had never been secured properly to begin with. That was just work. The laugh was the point.